Welcome to the Next Gen CMO podcast, where we sit down with seasoned CMOs and emerging talents in sales and marketing to explore the wins and occasional losses that shape today's leaders and the strategic maneuvers that can help propel you to the forefront of B2B marketing.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Next Gen CMO podcast. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Nick Cegelski to the podcast. He is the founder of 30 Minutes to President's Club, really the host of the world's #1 sales podcast. I listen to it all the time. I love it. It's in short little bursts. I drive, like during short drives, I'm like, oh, I'm just going to get a little hit of sales knowledge and expertise. And I'm not alone. Apparently, there's over 2 million annual streams. So a lot of people are engaging in this. I think it's every seller's best friend and truth teller, which is pretty awesome. So he's also the author of the international bestseller Cold Calling Sucks, and that's why it works, which is a super catchy name, and I'm excited about to dive into that a little bit. But for now, welcome, Nick. We're so glad to have you.
Really appreciate it. You know, that was so the first thing you ever told me when we met was that you actually listened to the podcast and you would do it on your short little drives. And I thought you were lying. I thought you were just like, it was like a rapport building thing. Like, oh yeah, I listened to your thing. But now that you've said it twice, I'm like, she's telling the truth. And that makes me so happy. And I'm also really glad that you like the book name because I was the one that came up with it. Originally, it was going to be called The Book on Cold Calling, which I just don't think is as catchy. And we can talk about like the naming convention if you want at some point, because I think we sort of did it intentionally. But I'm so happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And yeah, let's jump in.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think a great title makes a huge difference. It's why people pick up the book in the first place, right? It's what drives them and to get there. So I'm glad to hear that. We're actually going to probably start there. So one of the things that we love about Nick, besides the fact that he's just been a great friend to us and we've had very successful partnership with him for a long time, is that he comes to the show with a sales background, which we love because all marketers in general, but certainly all marketers working in account-based, really appreciate the partnership with sales. My own personal mantra, what I always tell my team is our mission is to make sales love us. That means that we have given them a brand that they're proud of, that we've given them an event setup and format that's conducive to what they need to do business, that we are giving them high quality pipeline, that we've made messaging and positioning and enablement super simple. We made the pricing easy to quote, easy to scale with larger customers, that we've just made their job super easy. And so sales like, man, without marketing, I couldn't do my job. That's what I want, right? Like that means that we're doing our job well. And so we love that. But you wrote this book, Cold Calling Sucks. One thing you write about in there is how events, which is a great overlapping point between marketing and sales, can be much more effective than actually just cold outreach. So what have you learned about events? Tell me a little bit about your approach to events, your strategy, what you've seen as successful strategies for leveraging and getting the most bang for your buck on an event.
Yeah. So there's two things that I think are really interesting about events from a outbound prospecting perspective for a sales team. Thing number one is generally when a prospective customer goes to a trade show, conference, event, they're out of their normal operating rhythm. And part of the thing that's different for them is they are looking to meet other people in the ecosystem that they operate in. They might be looking to learn about new products or technology. And so they're already in sort of a more open-minded space than the other 48 weeks out of the year that they're working, and they're just trying to get the job done and keep their head above water. So that's one dynamic that is different. Dynamic two that is different is oftentimes when I'm prospecting in the absence of an event, I have to be the one to be like, okay, what do I see about Kelly's business? How can I relate that to the problem that my product solves? And now I'm going for a Zoom meeting. And the reason to meet is trigger or observation, plus how my product might help with the condition the prospect is operating under that trigger makes me think they have. Well, with an event, it almost does some of the heavy lifting for me where I still want to have, and we'll talk about this, like I still believe you have to prospect hard for events. If you just show up and expect to stand at the booth and have your pipeline filled, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. But you don't need to have the world's best prospecting outbound message if there's an event going on, because oftentimes that can be the reason for your outreach and the reason for the meeting, and it doesn't have to be backed by as much of a hard product pitch. So I think it's not that, oh, great, event means I don't have to prospect for a week because I'm going to be in Austin and I'll be standing at the booth filling up my pipeline. It actually means it almost supercharges the outbound prospecting that I am doing. So that's sort of high-level take on it. I can go whatever direction you want from there.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I read your, I guess, a blog about how to really increase sales pipeline at conferences. And I thought it was super interesting because you talk about that. You talk about the need to have, to pre-prospect, don't get there and wander around aimlessly,
right?
Entering with meetings already booked, running those pre-discovery calls, leaving time on the floor, or leaving time to actually do your floor hunting, as you call it, kind of then finding additional meetings, either follow-ups or that you put, that you have live while you're there. I mean, it's a very different approach than just like, I'm going to go to the event, stop by a booth, hopefully make a connection. It's a very different model.
Yeah, I think that, so the biggest mistake that I see most teams make, so both marketing and sales teams, when they go to these conferences, events, trade shows, is they put a ton of effort into thinking about what the booth is going to look like. What's the demo video that we're going to have on the TV screens? What are we going to raffle away in exchange for business cards from, frankly, uninterested prospects who just wanted to win the iPad? And then everybody just stands there at the booth and they wait for the prospects to come to them. And I just feel like that's kind of backwards, where, yeah, you are going to have someone who's shopping for swag and going to every single booth, and you'll probably have a couple good conversations. But gosh, you can dramatically impact your success by doing a little bit of hunting and work in advance of the event. So piece one, before the event even happens, generally for me, I'm looking at 3 to 4 weeks before the event happens. I'm going in full-on prospecting mode for meetings at the event. I don't want to be the salesperson who has the initial contact with prospects at the event. I want to have initial contact via phone call, email exchange, so that at the event, I actually have a meeting on the books with a prospect. This is way better because it's one thing to have like a 3-minute conversation with somebody at the booth. It's another to have a dedicated 20-minute face-to-face meeting with somebody. That will accelerate that, if that turns into pipeline, way more than, okay, I met you at the booth for 2 minutes, we agreed to meet, I chased you for 3 weeks, and then finally we got on the books. So totally different tenor to the sale. So before the event, I would say, let's say 4 weeks for today, start prospecting for meetings to have at said event. And so there's a couple ways you can do this. Easiest way is if you can get the list of everybody who is attending the event, and you might need to go to your friends in marketing and say, hey, like, do we have this? Can we get this? Yes. Do we need to pay more for it? Because if you can get that list, it will have a dramatic impact on the ability to set meetings because you know who you're going after. Not always going to be possible. Some event organizers don't give it away. Sometimes your marketing team's like, sorry, budget's tapped. We spent it on whatever. That's okay. You can still prospect. You don't have an excuse. You can't say, whoops, all right, we don't have the list. I can't get any meetings. Recommendations here. Piece one, target prospects who are in the geo of that event. So if there's an event in Austin, I'm probably pulling my list of everybody in Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. That's another one. The Riverwalk I hear is really nice. Anyways,
it's really
I've never
nice.
been. I'm looking at that geo. That's one option. Another option is I can look at who went the year before. So I used to sell to law firms, and there was this big conference called the Association of Legal Administrators. And in 2024, for whatever reason, not able to get the list. If I could get it in 2023, generally the same people who went the year prior will be going the next year. So just prospect the old list. That's another option. Option 3, this is probably your last resort, is prospect your entire territory as if those people are going. So target the people who generally would go. In my event, when I sold to these law firms, there were really 3 big buying personas: the partners of the law firm, the IT department of the law firm, and then the legal administrator at the law firm. Okay, I would just prospect all of my legal administrators at all of the law firms, assuming they were going. And I don't know, I probably had a 60%, oh yeah, I am going, like, let's meet, in terms of people who responses. And the other 40%, they were like, no, I'm not going. All right, well, do you want to meet virtually? And you'll end up getting virtual meetings. So it's actually like you're almost using the event as a reason for reaching out, and it should boost your response rate. So start there. That's how I'm building the list. Okay. We're going to do one more thing, and then I will take a breath and let you get a word in, Kelly. Your messaging for this, you could sort of just like phone it in and be like, hey, Kelly, I'm going to be at the Association of Legal Administrators event. I would love to meet you if you're going to be there. Let me know if you'd like to schedule some time. I could literally just have that be my outreach. And that, honestly, like, it will work some of the time because they're going to meet people anyway. It's probably not the best approach. If you want to get a little bit more juice for your squeeze, I would recommend the following sort of framework for your outbounding for meetings at these events. Piece one is observation, something you see about their business. Kelly, I just noticed the big demand-based rebrand. It looks really, really great. You must be excited about getting the word out there. I'm going to be at XYZ conference next week, and I would love to chat with you about how 30 Minutes to President's Club could help amplify that message. Observation, something I think you want to do as the CMO of a company that just did a refresh, rebrand, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Open a meeting between 1 and 2, between the breaks between the big keynote speakers. That's it. Observation, going to be at this event, tiny bit of here's how I think we could help, and you'll get meetings in droves that way. I'll shut up for a second. You may have questions on some of that, but that alone should have a dramatic difference from a sales perspective on success at these events.
Yeah, I love it. I have so many thoughts. I'm going to share a few because I'll go super local. We had the Pavilion was here last week for the big go-to-market 2024 event. They were here in Austin. And so I've got a ton of requests for meetings because I was going to be there. So I would say the fourth path, you gave 3. The other fourth one, if you don't have any of those, is I was a speaker at the event. And so there was 100 speakers probably at the event over 3 days. And so if nothing else, you can go through the website. People who are speaking to marketers are probably marketers also. Yes. And so, or speaking to lawyers are probably lawyers also at whatever kind of event. Totally. And so I think people just went through the speakers, said, hey, I saw you're going to be speaking at Pavilion. Would you be open to meet before or after your session for 15 minutes? And that was another way. So going through the actual agenda and the speakers is probably a great way. And my LinkedIn blew up because people were like, oh, you're speaking. I'd love to connect. I'd love to connect. And it was just a way in. So
that's a really good one. I'm going to add that to my list. Thank you.
Yes. Look at that. We're working together. This is sales and marketing alignment right here. We're doing it. The other thing that you mentioned that's really helpful is really marketing and sales understanding each other's approach to these events, right? Marketing, of course, every event that I run is with the ultimate goal of driving pipeline for sure. Yeah. It's also about building community and expansion and all the things, but it's a lot about driving pipeline. But you're right. Marketing is thinking first and foremost about the booth, about the logistics, about the customer experience we're going to put on, about all these kind of things. And yes, we're driving the bookings to meetings or working with our sellers on that. But I don't know that we carry the same onus of like, oh, we need to make sure we get the attendee list or that we get the right scope or whatever to enable sellers. Are we giving them the right message to invite folks to that? So that's really helpful to kind of be hearing both sides of sort of the marketing priority, the seller priority, because at the end of the day, we all have the same goal. We're just sort of coming at it from 2 different angles. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned starting 4 weeks out on kind of reaching out to folks. I will tell you that it's 4 weeks out. I'm like, I'm going to reply to this email in 3 weeks right before I go. So is it usually if you start 4 weeks, you should start kind of repeating maybe once a week follow-ups, but you're going to get the bulk of the meetings like the week of as things get locked down. Like, is that what happens?
Totally. So one other thing, I guess this is obvious to me as a salesperson. It may not be obvious to the marketers listening. I'm putting these people in a pre-event sequence. I'm not just sending one message and you're going to see that message, Kelly. You as a prospect, you're going to delete that message. Because you're like, I'm going to address this in 3 weeks, whatever. Like, you're not going to remember. And this is another mistake I think a lot of salespeople make, is they think that all prospects are the same. So they hear Kelly's anecdotal experience of, hey, I like getting my meetings on the books the week before, 4 weeks too early. I know other prospects who are like, they want to plan their full timetable and they want that early. And you don't know. So I'm going to put somebody into a sequence where I'm going to have multiple touch points. I'm going to email them. I'm going to call them. I'm going to message them on LinkedIn. Gosh, Kelly, if you are really like one of my top prospects, shoot, I might send something to your office if I can to try to get your attention. I'm treating this just like any other outbound campaign. So I'm putting you in a sequence where, I'm going to reach out multiple times over that month. Some people will respond early and be like, I have no idea what my schedule is going to be like. Can we figure this out as we get closer? Great. That's a lot better than nothing. The problem also is if you actually think about like the schedule of a seller, I need to get started early because it's going to take me time to get the list of the 47 prospects in my territory who are going to the event into sequence, send them all that first email that's actually thoughtful, call them, leave a voicemail, follow up. Like it's going to take me, honestly, probably 2.5 weeks to get through the 3 or 4 touch points that like really are going to spike on your radar, where after that, there's a diminishing return to continuing to hammer you before a conference. So that's part of the reason that I would recommend starting earlier is if you wait to the last minute, I run the risk of, hey, my schedule's already full from a prospect. But then 2, if you just think about like your own personal bandwidth as a seller, you're cutting it a little too close to be able to effectively execute on that campaign.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I really like that because I haven't really thought about the prospecting of like, I ignore a lot of cold calls, right? Like cold emails that I receive.
As you should.
I'm more willing to, because I'm like, oh, I may run into this person at the event. I should probably respond because that might be awkward. But also too, like I'm in a mindset to meet with people when I'm at an event, like me as a customer. Right. I'm not in the mindset necessarily to meet with people all the time who are trying to sell me something like during the workday. Like I've got business to do. I don't really want to. If I'm at an event, I'm in the mindset. I'm in the space to talk to people live and have conversation. So the approach is actually really pretty genius because that's where you're going to get people who actually want to answer you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It's actually interesting. A couple of things that you said. You'll have people who don't respond at all. But then when you see them on the floor, they're like, oh, I think I got a couple of your emails. This is one area where I'm generally bearish on outbound video prospecting for the reasons of there's a lot of, with the face. So, but this is one area where I'm not because they'll be like, oh, I recognize you. And that's why like LinkedIn also, I want you to put the face with the name. I just feel like in absence of an event, me sending you a video that took me 4 minutes to record and risking your spam filter catching it because now I have an attachment. I don't know if that juice is necessarily worth the squeeze. But for these events, I think it is because you will often have people who say, oh, I recognize you. I saw your email. I saw your note. I meant to respond. I'm so sorry about that. And it also, one other thing, it forces you, when you do the prospecting prior to the event, it forces me to have a point of view on why I think your business should talk to me. So the worst thing for me to do is just show up and sit there at the booth with my arms crossed, or I'm on my phone, or I'm answering emails. It's not a very welcoming way to start conversations. And then Kelly ends up stumbling by my booth and I know nothing about her or her business. But if I've prospected prior to the event, hopefully I remember, oh, demand-based. Yeah, you all just had that big rebrand, right? That's a much warmer conversation than if I know nothing about you. So it's also a forcing function to have a perspective on why might this prospect need to buy my product?
I love it. I think that makes a ton of sense. So you get the meeting at an event as compared to you get the virtual meeting over Zoom.
Yeah.
Is that conversation different? That face-to-face meeting at an event versus like, I caught them on the phone, they happened to answer. I've got about 15 seconds before they're going to hang up on me.
Yeah.
Or I got them scheduled, but it's 30 minutes. They probably don't want to be here. They're probably multitasking through the whole thing.
Yes.
How is the conversation different as a seller? How should they approach it differently?
Yeah. So let's just set aside the cold call because that's a totally different perspective. I mean, it's not. I mean, so there's actually, let me zoom out. 4 types of meetings, 4 types of seller prospect interactions. Interaction 1 is cold call, right? You have probably 20 seconds to get their attention. The comparable conference interaction would be somebody comes to the booth or you run into them in the hall and you've got to be able to get their attention in that same 20, 30 seconds. I'll get to both of those in a second.
Okay.
Type 3 of interaction would be, let's call it your discovery call, your intro meeting, your first meeting with a prospect. Via Zoom would be comparable to that discovery intro interaction, that meeting that you set in person at the conference. So I'm thinking of 4 types, right? There's the, how do we get their attention, either virtually or in person? And then the, how do we run a meeting, either virtually in person? I would say that differences are more stark for the in-depth meeting. The prospecting interaction, how do we get their attention in 20 seconds? Here's my biggest piece of advice is, Kelly, have you ever taken a group photograph with a group of friends before? Somebody takes a photo of you and 12 of your friends.
Yeah.
When you look at that photo, who's the first person that you look at?
Yourself.
Yes, yourself. The best way to get somebody's attention is something about them. So the first things out of my mouth to get someone's attention should be something that I know about them. So if I bump into you in the hallway on the way to the lunch break, leaving the exhibit hall, and I see you and I know who you are, and I say, "Oh, Kelly, I love the big rebrand you all just did." Well, you're probably going to pay some attention to me, right? Versus if I say, "Hey, are you here for the conference?" We're both walking to the lunch break right now. So that's piece one, is getting somebody's attention starts with knowing something about them and then being able to quickly link that to, "Hey, here's how I think we might help." The way that I would recommend sellers think about this messaging is, if you notice X, what condition does that create for the other party that your product can help with? Oftentimes when I'm talking to somebody that's done a big rebrand, there's a ton of thought into how they're going to change the message, the logo, all of this stuff, but not as much thought into making sure that that actually gets the attention of the market in a really, really crowded revenue tech space. We work with a couple other folks like Gong and Outreach to help them do that. And I'm wondering if you'd be open to having a chat with me, Kelly. That's it. So something about you. What's the condition I think it creates for you that's a problem? Maybe brief social proof. Or are you open to talking? That's it. That's generally the framework I use on both a cold call as well as on a in-person interaction. You may have questions about that before I talk about the in-person meeting and how that's run differently.
I do have thoughts, but I'm going to wait until after you say it because they're related probably to all of it at one time. So go ahead and then I will chime in.
Great. The in-person meeting, here's things that are similar that I think people screw up. Piece one is you still need to set an agenda. This was a big mistake that I would make at conferences when I had in-person meetings. Was I wasn't really sure. Was it meant to be a get to know you meeting? Oh, where are you from? Oh, your son plays football. Oh, cool. And we would never really get to business. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum mistake I would make would be it would be the hard pitch of almost a very, very formal sales meeting. And nobody's really got time for that at these events. You said it yourself. You're here to meet a lot of people and learn about a lot of different things. And so all I want to do is I want to have a deep enough interaction that I am able to have a bit of back and forth about, okay, what's going on in your world? Sell you enough on, hey, I think we might be able to help with some of that stuff. And then use that as a way to get the next meeting, which will generally be virtual. And so what I want to do is set the agenda of hey, purpose for today is honestly to see, does it make sense for us to even keep talking after today's meeting? In terms of how we get there, I would love to learn a little bit more about this rebrand that I saw you all did, some of the goals that you have in doing it. And I can share a little bit about some of what we've learned when some of our other customers have done that and how we've supported them. And then I'm thinking, I know we had booked this for 30 minutes. I might say if we had a scheduled time, or I might say, and honestly, I know you're here to meet a lot of people and I am too. So I'm thinking we can probably end this thing at the 15-minute meeting mark and maybe talk at the end about does it make sense for us to even keep talking after today? So I want to set some sort of agenda, even in the in-person meeting. Reason for it is just I used to be confused as a seller about, should I just be doing get to know you, make small talk? Should I be doing the hard pitch? The prospect doesn't know also. And they've also had the experience of meeting with salespeople who go to one of those extremes. And we want to make it clear, hey, here's the plan for our interaction together. Last piece. Those in-person meetings, I try to end them early. Actually, this is a practice I've been trying to adopt more, even with virtual meetings. I think it's even more important in person. When you meet with an executive, you should try to end that interaction 5 minutes earlier than the expectation was set.
Oh my gosh, I'd love to get after every meeting.
The reason for it is I want to train you, Kelly, that if you meet with me, I'm not only going to respect your time, I'm really going to honor it and give you some back, which makes you more willing to meet with me again in the future. I would much rather have 2 25-minute meetings with Kelly than one 31-minute meeting with Kelly. So,
oh man, I love it. I think that's a great approach. So a few things that you said I wanted to respond to. Some relevant, some not so relevant. And that's okay. The not so relevant one is I won't hire anybody without a LinkedIn picture. By the way, you ask about, you mentioned about LinkedIn in the picture. Yep. When I don't see a photo, I'm no, I'm not hiring them. And it's not because I'm judging the way that they look. Yeah. It's because my head secretly is because they have a second LinkedIn profile because they're working multiple jobs or they've got different experiences. They've got something going on. There's something they're hiding. Yeah. Is always my feeling. It doesn't even have to be a cool picture. It can be kind of a side, whatever, something hardly recognizable. But at least I know that they're a human I can recognize. So that's one. The second one, fun fact, totally off script, is the reason why we look at ourselves in pictures and the reason that we judge ourselves in pictures so much is because, and I read this somewhere, I don't know, a long time ago, is that nobody's bodies are like perfectly parallel on both sides.
Yeah.
And so the only way I've ever seen myself is in the reverse, is in a mirror.
Yeah.
And so in a picture, I look bad because it's backwards from what I'm used to seeing. And so it doesn't match the way that I've ever seen myself. I've only seen the reverse of that. And so anyway, that's why we look at ourselves. We're like, man, it's a terrible picture. And people are like, no, you look great. Because that's how they see you all the time. But to you, you look backwards. And so something just looks like you.
Good. I am
fascinating.
Yeah, my wife makes me take pictures of her for like Instagram and stuff. And I always end up being told that I'm a terrible photographer and I have to take like 700 of them because she's like, I don't look good in this one or this one or this one. And now I'm going to teach her, this is what Kelly taught me. You do look good. This is going to save us so much time. Oh,
yes.
That's
take pictures of her in the mirror so that she sees the same view that she's used to seeing. And then she'll be like, oh my gosh, that's a great picture.
Wow. I did not think this would turn into relationship advice, but gosh, you just
saved marriage
to another level, Kelly. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm happy to help. Okay, back to business.
Yes.
All of this you've been sharing, it's just like oozing wisdom. And obviously your whole podcast does. I don't know if everybody heard the name. It's 30 Minutes to President's Club. Definitely give it a listen. But it's just so many super practical, tactical, pragmatic tips that people can do every single day. How did you learn all this? And what made you think, these are all the tips I want to learn, and then now I'm going to turn them into a way to teach other sellers to be better? What's your story? We just started there. We're going to go there now.
I like that you did that. That's a much better way to do it because now people are probably interested in the story if they've listened this deep versus starting.
There you go.
Like a lot of salespeople, when I started my first ever sales job, they said, here's your Salesforce instance. Here's your territory. Get calling. And I had no idea what to say or do or how to sound. And I got really, really frustrated because I would go to learn. I would go on LinkedIn and I would see people talking about the what to do, but not necessarily the how. And so I would see things like, hey, it's really important that you show up and do a great job at conferences. These are one of the best ways to book meetings and move your pipeline forward. Or a more simple one would be like, you got to sell value. You got to sit on the same side of the table as the customer. Success in sales requires empathy and listening skills. I don't disagree with any of those things, but when you're 23 years old and you show up to a meeting with a CFO and they say, all right, let's hear what you got. I only got 10 minutes. How do you be a good listener in that scenario? Like, how do you have empathy in that scenario? It's really, really hard. And so the biggest thing that frustrated me was there was a lot of sales and marketing content about what to do, but not necessarily how to do it. And so I started, it was funny. I lived, my wife and I, girlfriend at the time, we could only afford one car and she had to use it to go to the office. And so I bought an electric bicycle and I would ride 12 miles to work on the electric bicycle every morning. And to pass the time, I started listening to sales podcasts. And most of them were filled with that fluff, but I'd usually get 1 or 2 or 3 nuggets, and it started filling my brain up. And I ended up doing all right as a seller. You start to find your own way, but I never forgot that really frustrating experience of like, just like, tell me what to say. Not to say that like success in sales just requires parroting a script or following the step-by-step breakdown, but I just don't think there's enough practical content out there for sales and marketers. If you flash forward, this must have been 2020, and my college wrestling teammate, his name is Armand Farouk, he's also the founder of 30 Minutes to President's Club, he and I would like have a weekly Zoom, and he was working at the time as a director of sales for a company called Carta, and he and I, we would always share sales tips with each other. And pandemic hits, and we're like, man, what are we going to do? Like, all of the travel we were doing got shut down. Like, we're just sitting around at home. So we said, what would happen if we started a podcast? But the entire focus of the show was on the how to do, not on the what, where we would push guests to get practical and actionable and really, really step-by-step breakdowns with talk tracks, examples of what they would write in an email, etc. And if the guest couldn't do that, it sometimes hurt, but we wouldn't publish the episode because the audience is our customer in that way. Yeah. And so we did, and we've done almost 300 episodes now. And so I've gotten lucky in that I was a pretty good salesperson before we started the show, but I basically get free coaching every single week from the best sales leaders and salespeople out there. And I can just ask them the questions that I have. And so, yeah, I think I've gotten lucky in that respect. So that's a story.
That's awesome. And somewhere in there, you were also a volunteer wrestling coach. Did you partner with your founder for that as well?
No. So I wrestled at USC, University of Southern California, which is sort of an interesting program. It is a club team that competes with community college wrestling programs. So I like to tell people I went to USC, but I sort of did the equivalent of like wrestling at the community college level for 4 years, which was great. It was awesome. I got to like have the USC experience and get a USC education while also like competing, but it was not like the Division I experience where you were training 3 times a day, flying across the country, etc. But I kept working with that program after I graduated from college. And so I was a volunteer assistant, and I actually just started as a volunteer assistant at a high school fairly close to where I live. So I'm really excited about that because I love wrestling. I could talk about wrestling for hours if you wanted me to. It's
very cool.
Made me.
I don't know much about wrestling. Yeah. I don't know much about wrestling. I don't think we had a wrestling team growing up, so I don't know enough about it. But I do love sports and all things college sports and at that level. And I'm a big college football fan. And a tough loss you guys had to Penn State the other day, but it was
the USC football team. Just don't get me started there.
Well, trust me, I'm a Texas A&M football fan. Like we need. It's a tough road to be a fan of some of these teams, that's for sure. Cool. Okay. Well, that's awesome. So I love that you took that. I'm always tempted to always think like, how do I either transfer some of these skills somewhere or take this passion and turn it into a vocation of some sort? And, I love what I do with marketing, and I love that you did that with sellers and thought, man, like this is a real need state in the environment. And then you guys took this podcast and extended it into an event play, right? So connecting the dots back to where we started on events, in terms of, I don't know if it's events more than sponsorships or bringing your community together live. Like, what is the event approach to that, and how does that connect to the podcast?
So the way that our business and our media/content grew, one thing I actually want to go back to is the easiest way to make sure the content is good is to think about the customer, the consumer of the content, and you have to think about like, why are they listening at all? Or why are they watching at all? What is the problem they're looking to solve? What's the outcome that they're looking to achieve? And one thing that I like about this podcast is like, we've not really spent a lot of time like doing the belabored small talk or, wrestling, let's talk about that for 45 minutes, because people are listening to this because they want to move up in their sales and marketing career, not because they want to hear my story about being a wrestler. And so I think that's a really important thing is you have to think about like, what's the reason that the audience is listening in the first place? And the content should speak to that. So what did we do? So we grew this podcast. It grew and grew and grew. And we got to the point where I was making more money selling sponsorships for the podcast than I was in my tech sales job. Yippee. One I spent 8 hours a week on, the other one I was spending 40 hours a week on. And I said, okay, I know which one I'm going to do. So I went full time, which was July of 2022, which is right when a lot of the tech market got smacked. And I really had to step my game up just to keep us even alive and keep us in business. That said, I think one of the things that we reoriented around was, and this has nothing to do with the market, it has more to do with the point I made earlier about your end user, your consumer of your content. We thought, okay, what are the problems they're looking to solve? Well, they're listening to this content, but a lot of what we talk about is like how to write a really, really great sales email. How to show an awesome demo. And it's one thing to talk about those things. It's another to present visually. And so that's part of the reason we launched our webinar series, which we affectionately call Tactic Teardowns. Tried to have a more fun name than webinars because that usually has a boring connotation. But that was created for 2 reasons. Reason 1 is it has a visual medium for the end user. Like the end user can see, all right, great, we're going to pull up this sales email and let's talk about how it's formatted. Oh, look at how the seller used bullet points to like make it more skimmable. Look at the use of bold, color, etc. Right? So that's one piece. We did it for the audience. But then also like a lot of our sponsors put value in it because a podcast is we don't know the individual human beings that listen to any given episode. I do know the people that give us their name and email for a webinar. And a lot of our sponsors place a lot of value in that piece. It also helps them with attribution, et cetera, which I'm sure you have all sorts of thoughts on.
I do.
And then that naturally led itself to, we launched this newsletter, which actually that's probably been the biggest area that we've invested in because the newsletter allows us to direct attention to I don't want to say the flavor of the month, but like if we have a podcast episode we really want to juice, we can use the newsletter to promote that. With the webinar, we can promote that. We can promote sponsored content, et cetera. So yeah, that's sort of how it grew. I don't know if that actually answered your question, but it was what I said.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, it answers the question. What it does also is it ties back to what marketers are trying to do, which is really maximize the juice of the squeeze, right?
Yeah.
And so when we host an event, for example, or we host or we launch, a great piece of content, thought leadership content or something, we think, how can we get the most out of this thing? We put all this work.
Yeah.
It's not a one and done. We're not launching an ebook and walking away. We're taking an ebook and we're breaking it up into 12 little videos, and we're hosting a webinar about it, and we're going to do a social promo. We're going to pitch it to media for earned, and we're going to, build a whole podcast series. I mean, we're going to do all kinds of things with this anchor piece of content. So I love that you took this really practical advice, turned it into, obviously a forum with which to listen to that, took it to visual and applications people can actually see and feel it and all that good stuff. And you created it as a means of giving your sponsors skin in the game.
And I'll give you
access.
I'll give you a +1 to that, which is, okay, so I sent you that article that we had done, the newsletter article about how to work events as a salesperson. I reviewed that before I got on this, and it helped orient me around, okay, what were some of the talking points of the best practice I was going to say. We call it internally our connective tissue strategy, where podcast points at the webinars point at the newsletter points at the podcast. We reuse that content across different formats and mediums. And I feel so foolish because you asked about events and I'm like, oh, we don't really do those. I'm like, we do sometimes. We did an ad hoc one. We did one with Demand Base, actually. We did a really, really awesome meetup in New York City. And the reason that we were able to drive a lot of people at that was because of the newsletter. We were able to say, oh, that's the fastest path to get someone to take immediate action versus if I just run a bunch of podcast ads, I guess you'll have some people, but the direct action is much, much higher on newsletter. So yeah, that's part of it also, I guess.
Yeah. And I guess the newsletter, and I think you probably said this, but just making sure I heard this right. When you launch the webinar series, then that's how you're collecting email addresses to then go with the webinar. I mean, to go with the newsletter to drive that content. So one's kind of feeding the other. So that's that connective tissue. We used to call them, 360 campaigns or integrated campaigns. I love this connected tissue. It's almost like one thing drives to the next, drives to the next.
That's what it is, yeah.
And everything fuels everything else.
Right. We did it with our book. One of the things we did in the book was we put QR codes. So the book talks about best practices for cold calling. And one element of cold calling is it's not necessarily the words that you say. It's often more how you sound, your tonality. And so you can't really communicate that in a book. So we put QR codes in the book that take people to podcast episodes where we actually voice over the tonality, our YouTube channel. We also put links in there to get people to subscribe to the newsletter. And so we use the book as a distribution channel for our other channels. And so yeah, I mean, it all sort of feeds into it because if I can get somebody listening to the podcast and also reading the newsletter, they're much stickier as a user, consumer of our content than if they just have one. So yeah, I don't know. I don't want to act like I'm particularly smart in that respect. I think there's lots of people that understand maybe the methodology and the structure of this stuff better. I'm just telling you what we've practically done in our business.
Well, I think where it ties into our audience is, especially as marketers, but marketers and sellers, but for marketers is what that tells you is that customers receive content in different ways, right? Yeah. Some people like listening to a podcast. Some people like watching a webinar. Some people I like to be multitasking when I'm driving. That's why I always listen to podcasts in that way. But people like to read stuff. I mean, it comes in different ways. And so, everything we talk about this connected tissue, there's this, consumability of content. Yeah. And then there's the snackability of content as well. And that's where, when I got here, there was an ebook we had that was 268 pages. And I was like, seems like a novel, but we can call it an ebook if you want. And I was like, break that bad boy into about 80 different, small ebooks and then turn it into 100 different videos. Yeah. And that's our content strategy. But that thing should feed us for 2 years. Yeah. If we could just do something with it. But no one is reading at 286 because it's not snackable, right? Yes. It doesn't. So what are these kind of what's the derivative content we can take out of the anchor? And by connecting them all together, you're able to kind of meet people where they are in their journey, which again, it's kind of like an event strategy, right? You're just meeting people where they are and the mindset that they're in, the space that they're in. And it's all about being customer first in the way that you approach. And so I love some of these tips. I think they're applicable to marketers and sellers.
I love it. I could ask you more, but you were going to say something.
Awesome. Well, cool. I know we're coming up on time and I want to be respectful of your time so that you'll meet with me again because I'm so respectful of your time. So let me ask you for one thing. So one, for any listeners who are planning events, let's say, going into next year, what is one piece of advice you would give? Not necessarily the sales advice you'd give them, but just advice in general about either making the most of an event or bringing sales and marketing together around an event.
Right. I'll give something new. So when you're at these events, when you are not working the booth or meeting with prospects, get off your laptop, get off your phone, and I want you to walk the entire exhibit hall and meet with every single other vendor that is there. Go up to them, go to the booth, figure out what they do, and meet the people there. There's a number of awesome benefits from this. One, you still start to build your network in the ecosystem that you play in. So when I sold to law firms, I knew every salesperson and sales leader at these other legal tech vendors. And if I was ever at a place where I needed to find a job, or if we were hiring, I knew a ton of people in the space that I could lean on. Two, part of what makes you a good salesperson is understanding that ecosystem of, Kelly, if I'm selling to you as a CMO, it's one thing for me to just know like the very specific thing that my product helps with in your conditions. It's another if I know the tech stack that you might buy or the services that your business might use. And so just having even a high level understanding of those things, it gives me a huge leg up on other salespeople. Thing number three is you will walk away with so much free chapstick and mints and all sorts of swag that people literally can't give away. I mean, this is amazing. I've not sold to law firms since 2022, and I've got chapstick from peoplehunter.com. We help attorneys. We locate people for attorneys, and now they're getting free promo from me. But I have so much free chapstick, so that's sort of a silly one. But seriously, go walk, and you should do this if you work in sales. You should do this if you work in marketing. I'll actually give a real third tip, which is you'll start to learn how other people pitch and position their product. And you can say, oh, wow, that sounds really like the generic way that I'm pitching. I need to refine my message more. So go talk to everybody. You will learn so much. It's a great way to get like your one-day primer on the entire space that you sell into.
Oh, I love it. That's great advice. I love the idea of walking. Like you get such a better understanding of the ecosystem that any of your customers are operating in when you walk that floor. And yeah, they do have the best socks. I mean, the event, they do. I would be worried about
man-face socks that you all sent me. They are awesome. I've worn them twice already.
Awesome. Well, good. I love that. I wear mine all the time. I just wore some last week, actually, which is great. So that's great to hear. And I would be worried about 2-year-old chapstick, though. It seems like maybe it's gone bad. So you may want to...
I did have to throw some out because it was like something melted and stuff. So you're helping my marriage and my health. So this one's okay. But...
So 2 tips for your marriage, right? Take pictures in the mirror and throw out the old chapstick.
I love it.
Okay, we'll wind up. One last question. Any fun fact about you that people don't know that would be interesting for them to hear?
The first job that I ever had out of college was, that's not a good one. I'll actually give you a better one. The hardest way to grow a podcast is going from 0 to getting your first 100 listeners. It's much easier to go from 10,000 listeners to 10,100 than it is to go from 0 to 100. So when we launched our podcast, my co-founder and I made a commitment to each other that we were each going to personally text 200 people that we knew and ask them to listen to the show, write a review, and share, because we wanted to solve that 0 to 1, that cold start problem as fast as we could. And the first 50 people, easy. It's like your friends, your wrestling teammates, your family. Next 50, a little harder. The last 50, I'm literally texting ex-girlfriends being like, hey, we've been talking a couple of years, but I'm launching a podcast. So that might be a fun fact for you, which is there was a lot of grit and weirdness in launching that. Is that fun enough?
That's great advice. I think a lot of people probably have a secret passion for launching a podcast or launching something that scales and people listen to. So I love that advice. That's great to hear. I think, there's that first, what do they call that? Jeffrey Moore's adoption curve, right? Where you are sort of early in, you got to get those early adopters. And then once you get them, then momentum kind of sets in, and then the scale growth happens. So that's great to hear. Great advice. Well, Nick, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming. Listeners, thank you for joining us. And with that, we'll see you on the next episode of the Next Gen CMO podcast. Thanks, everyone.